They saw a quiet janitor and arrested her for trespassing. But what they didn't know? She wasn't just a janitor. She was a federal inspector, silently documenting every mistake. What happened next would change careers and expose an entire system, and she never even revealed herself. Before anyone ever put handcuffs on her wrists, Nia Holloway learned something most people never do. She learned what it feels like to be invisible. Not ignored in the casual way people overlook a stranger on the street, but truly unseen. Like a piece of furniture in a room, necessary but unnoticed, present but never acknowledged. That kind of invisibility doesn't come from shyness. It's taught, slowly, repeatedly, year after year, until it becomes a skill. Nia grew up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, in a narrow house with thin walls and a porch that sagged in the middle. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night, the same way Nia would one day pretend to do. Her father fixed elevators in hospitals and courthouses, always wearing a uniform that told people he was there to repair things, not question them. From a young age, Nia noticed how people spoke differently, depending on who they thought you were. When her mother wore her scrubs during the day, people called her ma'am. When she wore her cleaning uniform at night, they called her hey. Sometimes they didn't call her anything at all. Nia asked about it once, sitting at the kitchen table while her mother folded uniforms that smelled like bleach and wax. "Why don't they ever ask your name?" she asked. Her mother didn't look up. "Because names make people human," she said, "and some folks don't want to see that." That lesson stayed with Nia longer than any classroom lecture ever would. In school, she was quiet, but sharp. Teachers often mistook her silence for confusion. She learned early that speaking up didn't always bring clarity. Sometimes it brought consequences. So she watched. She listened. She noticed patterns other people missed. Who got questioned, who got excused, who had to prove themselves twice. By the time she left for college, she understood something crucial. The system didn't always fail by accident. Sometimes it worked exactly as designed. Nia didn't announce her ambitions. She didn't talk about justice or reform. She studied systems, logistics, compliance, risk management, the invisible machinery that keeps institutions running and breaking without anyone noticing. After graduation, she didn't chase attention or prestige. She took the jobs no one talked about: internal reviews, compliance audits, oversight positions that operated quietly behind the scenes. She learned how organizations lie to themselves, how reports are cleaned before they're filed, how policies exist only on paper, how power relaxes when it believes no one important is watching. Years later, when she joined federal oversight, her supervisor told her something she never forgot. "The louder the institution," he said, "the more it depends on silence to survive." That was when Nia realized invisibility wasn't a weakness. It was an advantage. She volunteered for assignments others avoided: night operations, low visibility audits, contract compliance reviews that required blending in rather than standing out. She learned how to dress down, how to soften her presence, how to let people assume exactly what they wanted. A clipboard was more powerful than a badge, a mop more revealing than a warrant. So when the Franklin County Courthouse came across her desk, flagged for irregularities that never quite crossed the threshold of formal complaints, Nia didn't request authority. She requested access: temporary cleaning credentials, third-party contractor status, night shift assignment. No one questioned it. They rarely did. On her first night at the courthouse, she arrived 10 minutes early and watched the security desk from across the lobby. 2 officers laughed over a phone screen. A third waved a lawyer through without checking ID. No one noticed the janitor. The building itself was old, heavy with history and neglect. Floors polished to a shine that hid cracks underneath. Portraits of former judges lined the walls, all stern faces, all watching nothing. Nia pushed her cart forward and felt the familiar calm settle over her. This wasn't pretending. This was observation. She moved through the building the way water moves, around obstacles, into corners, never forcing, never announcing. She cleaned, yes, but she also counted, timed, memorized. Which doors were locked only in theory, which cameras were decorative, which officers followed procedure when they knew they were seen, and which ones didn't. The thing about invisibility is that people talk around you, they relax, they show you who they really are. On her 4th night, she heard an officer joke about detaining someone just to remind them who's in charge. On her 7th, she watched a supervisor override a protocol without logging it. On her 10th, she realized no one had once asked her for identification beyond the first glance at a generic badge. She wasn't just unseen, she was unconsidered. By the 18th night, the pattern was clear, and by the 19th, it would all come to a head. But for now, Nia Holloway was still just a quiet janitor pushing a cart through marble halls, listening to footsteps echo behind her, knowing something most people never would. That the moment people stop seeing you as human is the moment they reveal everything about themselves. And soon, the courthouse would do exactly that. Midnight changed the courthouse. Not in any official way. The doors still stood, the cameras still blinked, the flags still hung motionless, but the people changed. Daytime was performance. Nighttime was truth. At 11:59 p.m., the last judge's chambers went dark. At 12:01 a.m., the building exhaled. Nia Holloway felt it every night the moment she stepped inside, the way shoulders loosened, the way voices dropped, the way rules quietly bent when no one important was around to enforce them. She pushed her cart past the metal detector, the wheels squeaking softly in a rhythm she'd come to recognize as her cover. The security desk barely acknowledged her. One officer nodded without looking up from his phone. Another leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, chewing gum like time didn't matter. "Evening," she said softly. No response. Perfect. The night shift wore comfort like armor. Procedures became suggestions. Authority became instinct instead of responsibility. Nia took the west corridor first, same as always. Not because it needed cleaning, it barely did, but because it told the most stories. This wing housed old courtrooms, evidence rooms, and offices no one liked to claim responsibility for. It was where accountability went to hide. She wiped down door handles slowly, counting steps between cameras. She knew which ones recorded continuously and which only flickered when movement crossed a narrow sensor line. She knew which angles left blind spots wide enough to walk through confidence itself. At 12:18 a.m., she passed two officers standing near the records room. "Man, nobody ever comes down here," one said. "Why would they?" the other replied. "Ain't nothing important left." Nia kept her eyes down. They didn't realize how wrong they were. She moved deeper into the building, toward courtroom 5. A space used only twice a month now, but still connected to active storage. The door was supposed to be locked after hours. It wasn't. She paused just long enough to note it, then continued mopping as if nothing mattered less. At 12:27 a.m., a man in a suit entered the hallway. No badge, no escort. He glanced at Nia, then away, relief washing over his face when he saw a janitor and not a guard. That relief mattered. People behave differently when they think the room belongs to them. He unlocked the records room with a key card and slipped inside. Nia didn't follow. She didn't need to. She listened to the click of the lock and the soft whir of a terminal coming online. She memorized the time, the angle, the fact that no one stopped him. When he left 6 minutes later, his expression had changed. Less relaxed, more alert. She cleaned the hallway after him, wiping fingerprints from surfaces he didn't even know he'd touched. This was how truth revealed itself, not in confrontations, but in comfort. At 12:41 a.m., her radio crackled. "Security to West Wing." She paused, not startled, not afraid, just attentive. She turned the corner slowly and saw them waiting. Two officers, one older, broad, with a face set permanently in suspicion, the other younger, restless, scanning her like he was searching for permission to act. "You," the older one said. "Stop right there." Nia stopped. "What's your assignment?" he asked. "Night cleaning," she replied evenly. "This area is restricted. I've been assigned here all week." He stepped closer, too close. "You got proof of that?" She reached for her clipboard. "Don't move," the younger one snapped. Her hand froze midair. That moment, that exact moment, told her everything. They weren't looking for clarity. They were looking for control. The older officer circled her slowly, eyes sharp, scanning her hoodie, her gloves, her face. "You've been hanging around this wing a lot," he said. "People noticed." Nia nodded. "It's on my route. What's your full name?" "Nia Holloway." "Badge number?" "I don't have one. I'm contract staff." The younger officer scoffed. "Figures." The word sat heavy in the air. Nia felt the familiar tightening in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. The same tone she'd heard her whole life. The sound of a decision already made. The older officer looked at her cart. Opened the bag. She didn't hesitate. Inside were cleaning rags, gloves, disinfectant, a small notebook, and a paperback novel with folded corners. The younger officer pulled out the notebook. "What's this?" "Personal notes." He flipped through it carelessly. Mostly blank pages. A few scribbles that meant nothing to him. He didn't understand what he was holding. "Turn around," the older officer said. There was no reason given, no escalation explained. Just instruction. The metal cuffs closed around her wrists with a sound that cut through the hallway like a verdict. Nia inhaled slowly. She did not protest. She did not ask why. She did not say the words that could have ended it all in seconds. Because this moment, this exact moment, was the reason she was there. They walked her down the corridor, past doors she'd cleaned dozens of times, past cameras that would later tell a very different story than the one these officers would try to explain. They placed her in a small holding room near intake, harsh light, metal chair, cold air. "You're being detained for unauthorized access," the older officer said, "until we figure out who you really are." Nia met his eyes calmly. "I understand." He frowned, unsettled by her lack of resistance. Most people argued, most people begged, most people gave him something to push against. She gave him nothing. The door closed, the lock clicked, and in the silence that followed, the courthouse began to confess. The holding room smelled of bleach and neglect. Cold fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Nia Holloway sat with her hands folded on the metal table, wrists slightly red where the cuffs had pressed into her skin. She didn't fidget. She didn't plead. She didn't speak, because that was the lesson she had learned long ago. Silence reveals more than words ever could. Across the table, Officer Marcus Ellison leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. He was broad-shouldered, confident, the kind of man who had never been questioned in his life. Not really. His partner, Jonah Price, fidgeted with his radio, voice low, eyes darting between her and the door. Both had been trained to assume, and that night they assumed wrong. "Why don't you say anything?" Ellison finally asked, irritation creeping into his tone. "You know, tell us your side. Make it easier." Nia's calm gaze didn't waver. "My side isn't needed," she said softly. Price scoffed. "Figures. Always some smart mouth in these situations." Ellison shot him a glare. "Shut up." The room went silent again. Only the faint hum of the building's air conditioning filled the gaps between their breaths. And in that silence, Nia's mind was already working. She ran through her mental checklist: camera angles, hallway access logs, timestamp verification, officer patrol rotations. Everything was logged. Everything. And someone was already watching, because she had ensured it. Her smartwatch had silently sent an encrypted alert the moment the cuffs clicked shut, transmitting her location, identity, and situation to the federal oversight team she worked with. She didn't need to tell them who she was. They would find out. Ellison's patience snapped. "Look, I don't care if you're janitor, supervisor, or some federal nobody. You don't walk into a restricted area and act like it's your office. That's not how this works." Nia tilted her head slightly, voice calm. "It is how this works when people like you make assumptions instead of following protocol." Price looked between them. "What the hell does that mean?" Ellison ignored him. "You're lucky no one was around to see you sneaking in." Nia's fingers flexed subtly against the cuffs. "Lucky? For whom?" That question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Neither officer answered, because deep down, even they knew they had already made a mistake. The kind that would linger, unspoken, in the corners of their careers. The room was small, the walls gray and unforgiving, yet Nia's presence filled it completely. Not loud, not brash, but undeniable. And then came the first whisper of consequence. A faint click from outside the door. Not a key turning, not a lock disengaging. Something subtler. Footsteps. Fast, precise, measured. Someone who moved with purpose. Price stiffened. Ellison tensed. The door didn't open, but the sound of a quiet inspection, of observation, of authority arriving, shifted the energy in the room. Nia didn't move. She didn't acknowledge it. She just waited, hands still folded, eyes steady. "Who is that?" Price whispered. Ellison shrugged. "Probably someone checking on us." But he wasn't sure, because he didn't know her. And in that not knowing, everything they thought they controlled began to crumble. Minutes stretched. No one came through the door, and yet the very act of someone watching made them nervous. Every subtle twitch, every defensive glance, every assumption they had made about her. Now it felt exposed. Finally, Ellison leaned forward, voice quieter, less confident. What are you even doing here?" Nia's answer was simple, precise, calm. "Observing what you think you control, documenting what you cannot see." That statement was not a threat, not a warning, not even a hint. It was truth, and it landed with a weight heavier than any raised voice could carry. Ellison's jaw tightened. Price looked away. They didn't resist. They didn't speak, because in that silence, they realized something crucial. The janitor they had handcuffed, the quiet woman they assumed to be nothing, already had the upper hand. She never raised her voice. She never yelled. She didn't even ask for respect. She only waited, and the consequences would come. Not today, not tomorrow, but inevitably, because people who think authority is a badge and a gun often forget the most powerful authority of all: knowledge, preparation, and restraint. Nia Holloway had all three, and the courthouse, with its silent corridors and overlooked corners, was about to deliver the lesson. The metal cuffs felt heavier than they were. Nia's wrists had been pressed against the cool steel table for nearly 10 minutes now, each minute stretching longer than the last. The fluorescent lights above flickered subtly, casting shadows across her face, exaggerating the quiet determination in her eyes. Across from her, Officer Marcus Ellison exhaled sharply, pacing. His partner, Jonah Price, leaned against the wall, rubbing the back of his neck, muttering under his breath. Both were uncomfortable. Neither admitted it. Both had assumed power was on their side, and for the first time that night, that assumption was unraveling. Nia sat perfectly still. She could feel the faint abrasion of the cuffs on her skin, but she didn't flinch. She didn't complain. She didn't even breathe, noticeably heavier. Pain was irrelevant. She had trained for discomfort, for invisibility, for the precise moment when people would misjudge her entirely. "You think this is funny?" Ellison finally barked. "You think you're playing some kind of game?" Nia's voice was soft, deliberate. "I don't play games." Price shifted uncomfortably. "Then why aren't you fighting back? Everyone fights back. Because fighting back confirms what you already believe," Nia said calmly. "It proves your assumptions." Ellison's eyes narrowed. "Assumptions? You're under arrest." Nia's lips curled into the barest hint of a smile, almost imperceptible. "Yes, you arrested me based on nothing but your perception. That's the assumption." The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any raised voice could. Ellison took a step closer, as if proximity alone could assert control. "Do you realize who you're dealing with?" Nia met his gaze evenly. "I'm dealing with you." He recoiled slightly, unsettled by her calm. Most people panic when authority is threatened. Most people struggle to regain control when the illusion of dominance slips. Ellison wasn't used to being unsure. Price fumbled with the cuffs, tightening them further. A small, sharp pain shot through Nia's wrists, but she didn't react. She simply flexed her fingers inside the restraints, testing, observing. Every twitch, every hesitation in their bodies was logged, remembered, catalogued. She had done this before. She had trained for exactly this kind of misunderstanding, exactly this kind of oversight, exactly this kind of arrogance. Her watch vibrated gently. A silent alert had been sent seconds after she was restrained. Someone was already watching. Someone was already recording. Every step, every gesture, every word, all would be documented. Ellison gestured wildly at Price. "Check her ID." Price looked through her bag with trembling hands. Rags, gloves, disinfectant, a small notebook. Nothing that looked like authority. Nothing that justified her presence. "She's lying," Ellison said. "There's no way she's supposed to be here." "She could be," Price admitted reluctantly. "But she hasn't done anything wrong yet." Ellison slammed a fist on the table. "She doesn't have to. You're supposed to stop them before they become a threat." Nia's calm eyes didn't leave his. "And yet, here I am, a janitor, restrained, compliant, and you are revealing exactly what the system is willing to tolerate without question." Price swallowed. "Wait, are you recording this?" Nia's smile remained gentle. Some of it is happening naturally. Some of it you're giving me freely." Ellison growled. "You think this makes you powerful? A janitor in cuffs?" "I don't think," Nia said softly. "I know." The silence pressed against them, heavy, uncomfortable, uneasy. Every second stretched. Ellison's anger began to crack. "Who sent you? Are you a federal agent or—" She didn't answer. Not a word. She had no intention of revealing herself now. The power wasn't in disclosure. The power was in observation, in patience, in letting people reveal their own failures. Minutes passed like hours. Outside the holding room, hallway cameras caught every movement. Inside, Ellison's swagger faltered. Price's nervous fidgeting grew. They didn't know her, and that ignorance was dangerous. Nia shifted slightly, not in panic, but in comfort. The cuffs weren't shackles. They were a reminder, to herself and to them, that restraint had power, that compliance could be the most disarming weapon in a room, that sometimes silence could be louder than shouting. Finally, Ellison leaned back, face red, chest heaving. I don't get it. You're just a janitor." Nia tilted her head slightly. "And yet, you are documenting, questioning, and hesitating, and I am not." He froze, and Price's frown deepened. The first real crack appeared in their facade, a seed of doubt, a quiet acknowledgement that they might have been wrong. And that was all Nia needed, because power doesn't always need a badge, a gun, or a title. Sometimes it only needs patience, knowledge, discipline, and the ability to let people believe they are in control while quietly ensuring they are not. That night, as the building hummed with quiet air circulation and distant echoes of maintenance machinery, Nia Holloway sat restrained, calm, and unseen. And she knew, fully, that by morning, the consequences of this night would begin to unfold. Not because she revealed herself, not because she raised her voice, but because the system had already begun to betray itself. The hallway outside the holding room hummed with quiet machinery. Air vents exhaling in measured rhythm, pipes humming under the floor, fluorescent lights flickering above like tired sentinels. Nia Holloway remained seated, her wrists pressed slightly raw from the cuffs, but her posture impeccable, calm, poised, invisible. And yet every observation she had made over the past few nights was converging now, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. Ellison and Price had retreated slightly, leaving her in the room alone, or so they thought. Nia's fingers flexed inside the cuffs. A small vibration from her smartwatch went unnoticed by them, but it meant everything. The encrypted alert had reached the oversight team. Every hallway camera, every motion sensor, every minor security breach she had noticed over the past weeks had been logged and correlated with her presence tonight. They had a full picture, even if she hadn't spoken a word. The officers outside were murmuring among themselves. She could hear it faintly through the door, but she didn't react. She didn't need to. Their voices were a confession. Every doubt, every hesitation, every glance toward the door was a subtle admission. They had overstepped, and they knew it. Time stretched. Minutes, hours, measured only by the subtle shifts in light and the occasional echo of footsteps in distant corridors. Nia reflected on the first lesson of her career. Control is not shown in force. It is shown in restraint. The building itself seemed to recognize her calm. Doors that should have seemed forbidding were neutral. Cameras that monitored relentlessly were merely passive observers. And she, sitting silently, had become the only entity truly aware of everything in motion. Her mind wandered briefly to her childhood in Pine Bluff, to nights when her mother scrubbed floors under dim fluorescent lights while lecturing her on patience. "Nia," her mother would say, "you can't make people see what they're not ready to see, but you can make sure they can't hide what they've done." That lesson had been the foundation of every operation she had overseen since joining federal oversight. Every audit, every investigation, every undercover assignment depended not on confrontation, but on letting the system reveal itself. Ellison returned to the room, pacing, his face tight with frustration. Price followed, whispering in tones too low for her to catch. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the table. She didn't flinch when he slammed his hand against the metal. She didn't react when he leaned over, scrutinizing her face for any hint of weakness. "You think you can just sit there and watch?" Ellison growled, his voice low but sharp. "I already am," Nia said, her voice steady, measured. "You've made assumptions, ignored protocol, and exercised authority without verification. Every action has consequences." Price's hands trembled slightly as he reached for her bag again. We should check her credentials. There has to be something." Nia's gaze didn't waver. "Go ahead, check. Every door, every log, every system in this building is traceable. You're already being documented." Ellison laughed, but it was a brittle, hollow sound. "Documented? By who? You?" Her smile was faint but precise. "Not by me. By the people who designed the systems you ignore every day." The weight of those words hit him differently than any shouted accusation could. For the first time, Ellison felt exposed. Every shortcut, every dismissal of procedure, every assumption he'd made about people like her, all laid bare in his mind. Minutes later, they were interrupted by the soft but deliberate sound of footsteps in the corridor. Not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate. Someone who knew exactly where to walk, how to move, how to observe. Ellison stiffened. Price turned pale. Neither moved to the door. Neither acknowledged the truth forming before them. Someone with authority had arrived. Though Nia herself did not rise, did not speak, did not reveal anything. Through the closed door, she felt the subtle shift. The courthouse had begun to self-correct. Procedures that had been ignored were about to be enforced. Decisions made without oversight were about to be challenged. And the officers who had assumed control would face the consequences, quietly, inevitably. Her wrist vibrated again. Another silent alert confirmed that the oversight team was monitoring live feeds. Every subtle movement, every gesture of arrogance or hesitation by Ellison and Price was being recorded and analyzed. She allowed herself a brief inward smile. Silence is not weakness. It is strategy. For Nia, the lesson of the night was clear. Those who assume authority without verification will always be revealed by the very system they try to control. And tonight, the courthouse would prove it. Hours would pass. careers would falter, and she, the janitor everyone had dismissed, would remain unseen, yet fully in control, because she understood something no badge, no gun, no title could teach. True power is quiet, calculated, and patient, and in the silence, the first ripple of consequences had already begun. Dawn was creeping over the city, though inside the courthouse the fluorescent lights hummed steadily, as if mocking the passing of time. Nia Holloway remained seated in the holding room, her wrists still marked by the faint red impressions of the metal cuffs. The night had been long, tense, but her mind was clear, calm, focused. Outside, the courthouse was waking up. Clerks shuffled papers, security officers changed shifts, and administrators arrived, unaware of the storm already forming in their midst. The ripple had begun. Back in the holding room, Officer Marcus Ellison sat slouched against the wall, replaying every detail of the night in his mind. Jonah Price stood near the door, fingers twitching nervously. They had assumed control, enforced authority, and now they were beginning to feel the first whispers of accountability. Nia's smartwatch vibrated again, subtle, almost imperceptible. Another silent alert had gone out. This one wasn't just to oversight. It was reaching analysts, auditors, and federal investigators who specialized in protocol breaches. Every motion, every misstep, every assumption had been logged, time-stamped, and tagged. Minutes later, a faint tapping at the door signaled the arrival of someone with official clearance. "Ms. Holloway?" a measured voice called. Ellison and Price stiffened. The door opened. A woman in a gray suit entered, carrying a thick file. Her presence was quiet but undeniable. She scanned the room, eyes lingering on the officers before finally resting on Nia. "I'm Special Agent Claire Whitman, Department of Federal Oversight," she said calmly. "I've been notified of an incident last night." Ellison swallowed. We were just..." Whitman's gaze cut through him. "I've reviewed the initial logs and camera feeds. You two restrained Ms. Holloway without verifying credentials, without probable cause, and without following protocol. Is that correct?" Ellison hesitated. "Well, she was in a restricted area. She is assigned to that area," Whitman interrupted smoothly. "Her access is documented, and her movements are part of ongoing compliance monitoring. Do you understand the gravity of what you just did?" Price's face went pale. Ellison opened his mouth, but no words came. Whitman placed the file on the table. Inside were screenshots, security logs, video timestamps, and her own notes compiled over weeks. Each page detailed minor protocol breaches, overlooked access permissions, and moments of assumption by the officers, all culminating in last night's incident. "This isn't about malice," Whitman continued. "It's about systems failing when people rely on instinct instead of procedure, and your instinct nearly compromised a federal operation." Ellison's throat tightened. "Operation?" Price's hands trembled. We didn't know." Whitman didn't look at them. "Exactly. That's the point. Ms. Holloway's work depends on being unseen, unchallenged, until oversight is required. And yet, you attempted to assert authority based on assumptions, ignoring protocols that protect everyone, including yourselves." Nia remained calm, arms folded, eyes steady. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke volumes. Whitman continued. "Internal Affairs has already been notified. You will be placed on administrative leave pending review. Every decision, every action you took last night will be documented, and Ms. Holloway's report, already logged, will accompany your files." Ellison sank into the chair, realization dawning. "Our careers?" Whitman's voice was neutral. "You made your choices. The system will correct itself, and you will answer for your actions. That is the consequence of ignoring protocol." Price's voice cracked. I didn't. You did exactly what you're trained to avoid," Whitman said. "You relied on instinct. You assumed. And now you will see the result." The room was silent. Only the faint hum of lights and the subtle clicking of cuffs against metal filled the space. Nia remained seated, calm. Her restraint had become her power. Minutes later, she was uncuffed. Whitman escorted her out of the holding room. The officers were left behind, frozen, aware of their error, but powerless to undo it. In the hallways, as Nia pushed her cart and quietly cleaned as if nothing had happened, the first ripples began to spread. By mid-morning, internal memos were circulating. Supervisors who had previously ignored procedures found themselves questioned. Security logs were re-examined. Officers across the building were reminded of protocol in sharp, unmistakable memos. And all the while, Nia remained unseen. The janitor who had been detained had never revealed her true identity. She walked quietly, invisibly, cleaning floors, wiping surfaces, moving with purpose. But the consequences of her restraint, her patience, her knowledge, her silence, were already echoing through the courthouse. She paused briefly outside a courtroom, looking down the hallway. Every step she had taken, every moment she had endured, had been deliberate. The officers would learn, not from confrontation, not from argument, but from the system itself. The consequences would unfold naturally, inevitably, and they would understand, eventually, the cost of assumptions. Because Nia Holloway had shown them a truth that authority often forgets. Silence, patience, and knowledge are more powerful than force, more precise than rage, and more enduring than fear. The courthouse, and everyone in it, had begun to shake, quietly, invisibly, irreversibly. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse had returned to its usual rhythm. Clerks shuffled papers, court sessions began, and security officers went about their rounds. To most, nothing seemed amiss. But beneath the surface, the events of the previous night were already sending shockwaves through the building. Nia Holloway moved quietly, pushing her cleaning cart down a long corridor. Her uniform was simple: navy slacks, a plain white blouse, an apron over it. Nothing that drew attention. She carried herself with a rhythm that made her nearly invisible, yet every step, every subtle glance was calculated. She observed everything: cameras, access points, security officers, their body language, the micro-expressions of administrators as they passed. Every detail was catalogued for later. Her work was meticulous, deliberate. She dusted, swept, and sanitized not just floors, but the environment itself. The spaces where assumptions thrived, the corners where mistakes had been made, the areas where shortcuts had allowed negligence to hide. She had learned early in her career that cleaning surfaces was only half the task. The other half was observing what people left behind. Across the courthouse, Ellison and Price sat in the administrative office, summoned by Internal Affairs. Their superiors, mid-level managers, and auditors were already reviewing reports, camera footage, and logs from the night before. Ellison tried to maintain a posture of confidence, but every glance he received from his peers chipped away at it. Price's hands shook slightly as he signed form after form, each one detailing his failures of protocol and judgment. The ripple was spreading. Emails circulated quickly, quietly. Supervisors who had previously ignored minor breaches found themselves called to explain why oversight had failed. Security logs that had gone unexamined for months were suddenly under scrutiny. Every officer who had taken shortcuts or relied on gut instincts was reminded, subtly but clearly, that the system was watching. Ellison tried to speak, to defend himself. "We were just following procedure. A senior auditor looked up from the screen, voice calm but sharp. "You failed protocol. You detained an authorized federal inspector without verification. That's not opinion. That's fact." Price looked at Ellison, fear flashing in his eyes. They had assumed that no one would notice, that no one would question their authority. Now they were learning the cost of arrogance. Meanwhile, Nia moved silently through the halls, sweeping and dusting, unobtrusive and unseen. Yet everywhere she went, she left a subtle mark, evidence meticulously documented by her smartwatch alerts and motion logs. The oversight team had begun to trace patterns, correlating every movement with officer interactions. Each misstep they had made became undeniable. By late afternoon, Ellison and Price were being interviewed repeatedly. Internal Affairs had already begun drafting recommendations: suspension, retraining, and in some cases, termination. Supervisors who had overlooked these officers' tendencies to rely on assumption were being questioned about their leadership. The ripple was real, and it was spreading faster than either officer could contain. Nia paused briefly outside a courtroom, listening to the faint murmur of lawyers and clerks inside. She smiled slightly, not for recognition, not for reward, but because the system she had served silently for years was now asserting itself. The consequences she had set in motion were not loud or public, but they were precise. A young clerk passed by, glancing at her briefly. "You're the new janitor, right?" Nia nodded politely. "Yes, I'm Nia Holloway." The clerk smiled, unaware of the invisible storm that accompanied her calm, professional demeanor. "You're doing a great job. The place looks cleaner already." Nia's smile was gentle. "Thank you." Inside, Ellison and Price were both pale. Reports, footage, and logs had been compiled into a dossier that left no room for defense. Every assumption they had made, every violation of procedure, every moment of overconfidence, all documented. Careers that had seemed secure were now precarious. By evening, the ripple reached beyond the courthouse. Notifications to higher federal offices, oversight committees, and compliance auditors were already underway. Policies were being reviewed, training programs adjusted. The officer's actions had unintentionally triggered systemic scrutiny that could not be undone. And through it all, Nia Holloway remained unseen. The janitor, the quiet woman who had been handcuffed and disrespected, had never revealed her identity. Her work, her vigilance, her restraint, all of it was laying the foundation for accountability, justice, and reform. She cleaned one last corridor before sunset, pushing her cart with deliberate rhythm, listening to the subtle echoes of footsteps that carried the weight of realization. The courthouse had begun to correct itself, not with shouting, not with confrontation, but with quiet truth and methodical patience. Nia paused at the end of the hall, looking at the polished floors and gleaming surfaces. She whispered to herself, soft as a breath, "Silence is not weakness. Restraint is not inaction. And the truth always speaks." The ripple would continue to spread. Careers would falter, procedures would change, and the quiet janitor, the unseen federal inspector, would remain invisible, her presence felt only in the consequences she had set in motion. Because real power doesn't need recognition, it only needs patience, discipline, and the courage to let the system work as it should. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, soft and pale, but it did nothing to soften the tension that had settled over the building. From the outside, the courthouse appeared unchanged, just another day of hearings, clerks, and routine procedure. But inside, the air was charged with quiet apprehension. The events of the previous night had set a chain of consequences in motion, and now the full weight of them was being felt. Nia Holloway moved silently through the halls, her janitorial cart gliding across polished floors. She made no noise, no announcement, no gesture that suggested she was anything more than the quiet, competent woman who ensured the building was clean. Yet behind every door, on every floor, her presence lingered in thought. Those who had brushed off protocol, who had relied on instinct rather than procedure, now felt its oppressive weight. Officer Marcus Ellison sat at his desk, staring blankly at the screen before him. Internal Affairs had compiled a full report, including camera footage, motion logs, timestamps, and eyewitness statements. His actions were documented in microscopic detail. Every step he took, every word he spoke, every assumption he made. Jonah Price fidgeted in his chair across the room, pale and silent. He had tried to justify his actions, to defend himself, to explain that he had only followed instinct. But instinct had failed him, and in the courthouse, instinct was no defense. An email notification chimed. Ellison opened it reluctantly. The subject line read, "Internal Affairs Recommendation. Immediate review required." The body of the email was precise, clinical, and devastating. Due to multiple protocol violations, including unlawful detainment, failure to verify identification, and improper use of authority, the officers involved are to be placed on administrative leave. Additional disciplinary action, including termination, is under review. Supervisors who failed to enforce protocol will also face review. Ellison's hands shook slightly. The ripple was now undeniable. The consequences of a single night's misjudgment were cascading outward, touching every level of the courthouse hierarchy. Supervisors who had ignored small lapses in procedure were now under scrutiny. Security officers who had tolerated shortcuts were being retrained. Even the clerk who had witnessed last night's events without intervention received a warning about compliance. Nia continued her rounds, oblivious to the chaos she had quietly orchestrated. Each hallway she passed, each door she opened, each surface she polished was a reminder of her presence, her patience, and her restraint. She had never raised her voice. She had never demanded recognition. And yet, the consequences of her actions, or inaction, were spreading faster than any announcement could have achieved. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse held an emergency meeting with all supervisors. The topic was protocol enforcement, accountability, and compliance. The meeting was tense. Whispers filled the room before the discussion began. Everyone knew, at least subconsciously, that the events of the previous night had exposed vulnerabilities, not just in procedure, but in their assumptions, biases, and readiness. Whitman, the special agent overseeing the operation, stood at the head of the room. Her voice was calm, controlled, and direct. Last night, 2 officers acted without verifying identification, detained an authorized federal inspector, and violated multiple protocols. What happened could have compromised an operation critical to federal oversight. This is unacceptable. Every action, every oversight, every assumption will be reviewed, and every person who allowed these lapses to occur will be held accountable. Heads nodded, shoulders slumped. The weight of accountability settled over the room like a heavy fog. Meanwhile, Nia paused near a quiet stairwell. Her wrists bore faint red marks where the cuffs had pressed, a small reminder of the night's ordeal. She traced a finger over the faint impression, not in bitterness, not in pain, but in quiet reflection. She thought of the officers, Ellison and Price, and what they had done. She thought of the supervisors who had ignored minor lapses, and of the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed assumptions to outweigh procedure. She thought of the courthouse itself, a structure built on rules, order, and compliance, now trembling slightly under the weight of its own oversights. And then she thought of herself, a janitor, a quiet observer, an unseen force whose patience and restraint had set the system in motion. By evening, the ripple had reached the media. Anonymous leaks from internal oversight confirmed that 2 officers were under review, that procedural lapses had been documented, and that systemic reform was imminent. Careers that had seemed secure were now uncertain. Policies were being rewritten, training protocols were being updated, and through it all, Nia remained invisible, a silent agent of accountability. Her phone vibrated gently. A message from Whitman appeared. "Excellent work. The system is responding as it should. Remain discreet. Continue observation." Nia smiled faintly. She had not sought recognition. She had not demanded justice. She had only followed procedure, patience, and her training. And now, without fanfare, without disclosure, without confrontation, change was occurring. That night, she paused at the same spot in the hallway where she had been detained. She looked at the polished floors, the cleaned surfaces, the faint reflections in the glass. The space had been transformed, not by shouting or anger, but by quiet observation, patience, and meticulous restraint. She whispered to herself, soft as a breath, "The world may not always see power, but it always feels consequence." And in the silence, she knew the courthouse, the officers, the supervisors, the system itself had already begun to learn that lesson. The courthouse was quiet as Nia Holloway moved through the halls, her janitorial cart making soft, rolling sounds against the polished floors. Most people barely noticed her, a shadow in navy slacks and a plain blouse, gloves on her hands, hair pulled back in a tidy bun. But Nia's eyes missed nothing. Every camera, every security breach, every misstep from the previous night replayed in her mind like a well-rehearsed operation. Ellison and Price were no longer part of her immediate focus. Their fates had been set. Ellison had been placed on indefinite administrative leave. Price had resigned quietly, unable to face the consequences of his actions. Supervisors had received warnings. Internal memos demanded retraining, accountability, and adherence to protocol. But Nia's work wasn't done. She understood that real change was not about single victories. It was about embedding vigilance into the system. Every hallway she cleaned, every room she polished, every surface she touched carried subtle lessons. Floors polished so carefully that any footprint would be noticed. Doors aligned to ensure no security breach went unobserved. Motion detectors and cameras mapped in her mental logs. The janitor's touch became a silent audit, an invisible force ensuring that the courthouse could not ignore the principles she upheld. Mid-morning, a young clerk approached her. "Hey, you're the janitor everyone talks about, right?" he asked, a faint nervousness in his voice. Nia paused, giving him a gentle, calm smile. "I'm just doing my job," she said. "Attention to detail is all it takes." He nodded, eyes wide. "I mean, you seem everywhere. How do you know so much?" Nia didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. Instead, she gestured toward the floors she had polished. "Look carefully. Most things are obvious when you slow down and pay attention. The rest, you learn by observing." The clerk's expression shifted, a mixture of admiration and realization. Nia moved on, leaving him with that thought. Quietly, subtly, the influence she exerted spread through those who watched carefully. Meanwhile, in the Internal Affairs office, Whitman convened a meeting. Supervisors, security officers, and clerks were present, tension thick in the air. She laid out the findings from the past 48 hours, procedural lapses, recorded interactions, misjudgments, and the cascading consequences. Each incident traced back to assumptions, shortcuts, and failures to observe protocol. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Whitman said firmly, "but when one person demonstrates restraint, vigilance, and integrity, even in silence, it forces the system to correct itself. This is the invisible force of accountability, and it works, whether it is recognized or not." Nia, observing quietly from the back of the room under the guise of routine maintenance, felt a faint satisfaction. She didn't need accolades, applause, or recognition. Her impact was evident in the trembling confidence of Ellison and Price, the tense scrutiny of their supervisors, and the heightened vigilance now embedded in the courthouse staff. She thought back to her first night under cover, the handcuffs pressing into her wrists, the fear and frustration she had felt, and she understood how that moment had become a catalyst, not just for her own resilience, but for the ripple effect that would reform the system. Patience, silence, observation, that was the true power. By late afternoon, federal oversight reports began circulating to higher authorities. Naya's alerts, her careful documentation, her silent orchestration of accountability, all fed into a larger picture of compliance and systemic integrity. The courthouse, unknowingly, was becoming a model of procedural enforcement, not because of loud confrontations, but because someone had quietly ensured it would be. Back in the hallways, Nia paused near the entrance to the main chamber. She glanced at the polished floors, the gleaming surfaces, and the subtle lines she had left. Each one a reminder that even the smallest touch can create awareness, that silence and restraint could reshape an entire environment. She whispered to herself softly, "You don't need to be seen to be powerful. You only need to be effective." And as she pushed her cart toward the next corridor, the invisible force she represented, integrity, vigilance, patience, moved ahead of her. Slowly, inexorably, it was reshaping not just the courthouse, but the culture within it. Careers would continue to be examined, protocols strengthened, and vigilance normalized. And all of it had started with the quiet janitor who had been detained, underestimated, and yet had never revealed her true identity. Nia Holloway walked through the halls, unseen but fully present, an invisible force ensuring that justice, accountability, and integrity could no longer be ignored. The courthouse was calm that morning, but it was a calm built on new rules, vigilance, and awareness. Everything had changed, though no one outside the immediate circle fully understood the depth of the transformation. The officers involved, Marcus Ellison and Jonah Price, were already living the consequences of their actions. Supervisors who had ignored procedural safeguards now faced scrutiny. Policies were being rewritten, and mandatory retraining programs were rolled out. Nia Holloway moved through the halls as she always did, silently, deliberately, focused not on recognition, but on impact. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows painted the floors in gold and shadows, highlighting the surfaces she had meticulously polished. She paused, glancing at a security camera that had recorded every moment of the incident. A small, satisfied smile curved her lips. The footage wasn't for public attention. It wasn't for accolades. It existed to ensure accountability, integrity, and the unwavering rule of procedure. In one office, Marcus Ellison sat at a desk, reviewing the internal affairs report with trembling hands. Every page documented his mistakes. Every timestamp and motion captured his misjudgment. He tried to rationalize, to find an escape route, but there was none. The quiet janitor he had detained, the woman he had underestimated, had orchestrated the system's response with precision. Jonah Price, similarly, sat in a small conference room, staring blankly at the polished walls. He had resigned quietly, hoping to avoid the scrutiny that was coming. Yet he knew he could not escape the lessons of that night. Even outside formal consequences, the weight of his actions lingered. He had learned the hard way that assumptions, bias, and instinct could never outweigh knowledge, patience, and protocol. Meanwhile, Special Agent Claire Whitman circulated a memo to the higher federal oversight offices. It highlighted the cascading effects of the incident. Systemic improvements, policy reforms, retraining programs, and a renewed culture of vigilance. The changes were quiet but profound, rippling through the courthouse in ways no one expected. Nia paused outside the main courtroom, listening to the faint hum of activity inside. Lawyers discussed cases, clerks shuffled papers, and security officers moved with a newfound awareness. The courthouse had not just survived the previous night's chaos. It had begun to thrive under stricter adherence to protocol and increased mindfulness. A young cadet, visiting for an observational program, passed by and glanced at her. "Excuse me, are you really just the janitor?" Nia met the cadet's wide-eyed gaze and smiled gently. "I am. But remember, what you see is rarely the full story. Actions, patience, and integrity often go unseen, but their impact is always felt." The cadet nodded thoughtfully, and Nia moved on. Her presence was subtle, her lessons embedded in silence and careful observation. She had taught more than compliance. She had taught restraint, awareness, and the quiet power of acting without needing recognition. By late afternoon, the ripple extended beyond the courthouse. News of procedural reviews, officer accountability, and improved oversight circulated internally across departments. The ripple was quiet, invisible to most, yet it was changing the culture from within. Nia returned to the hallway where the incident had occurred. She looked at the polished floor, the faint reflections in the glass, and the corners she had cleaned with meticulous attention. That hallway, once a stage for misunderstanding and misjudgment, now embodied vigilance, patience, and accountability. She paused and whispered to herself, "Recognition is not always necessary. Impact is." Her phone vibrated with a new message. It was from Whitman. "The courthouse reports are excellent. Oversight has improved. Your methods are being adopted elsewhere. Keep observing, quietly." Nia smiled, slipping the phone back into her apron pocket. She didn't need applause, headlines, or acknowledgement. The system itself, the ripple of accountability, and the subtle lessons she had embedded were enough. As the sun set over the courthouse, casting long shadows across the floors, Nia pushed her cart down the hall one last time for the day. Every surface gleamed, every corner reflected the quiet order she had imposed, and every officer, clerk, and supervisor moved with heightened awareness, their actions subtly shaped by the invisible force she represented. In that moment, Nia Holloway, the quiet janitor who had been detained and underestimated, knew she had succeeded, not through confrontation, not through revelation, but through patience, resilience, and the quiet power of doing what was right even when unseen. Her lesson was clear, and it was enduring. True influence does not demand recognition. It manifests in the change it inspires. The courthouse had learned it. The officers had learned it. And in silence, Nia Holloway continued to teach it every day. Moral of the story: true strength and influence are not always loud or visible. Patience, integrity, and vigilance, even when unseen, can create profound change. Actions done correctly, calmly, and with purpose leave a lasting impact, often more powerful than recognition or accolades. In life, the quiet decisions you make, the discipline you uphold, and the respect you demand for justice can ripple far beyond what you see. You may be underestimated, ignored, or misunderstood, but your restraint and integrity will always shape the outcome. If you believe in the power of resilience, integrity, and quiet strength, subscribe to Momentum Stories. Here, we share real and fictional tales that inspire, motivate, and remind you that every action counts, even the ones no one sees. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that moves you forward.